Welcome to Aspirations Over Hesitations, the podcast for high-achieving women whose ambitions are bigger than their fears. I'm your host, Alli Eldridge. As a mom, wife, and Fortune 500 company retiree, I know what it's like to wear many hats while still wanting more out of life. Whether it's stepping off the corporate ladder to lean into motherhood, healing yourself from chronic health issues to bring home that miracle baby, or launching your own business, you'll be inspired by stories of women who are going for the big things in life, in spite of anxiety that they too have experienced. Here, you'll find a community of moms who can relate to wanting what others say is impossible. They embrace alternative ways of thinking, working, and being, even when it comes with some uncertainty. One thing's for sure. If you want to live an unconventional, extraordinary life full of freedom and flexibility, you have to be willing to do things a little differently. Are you ready to say yes to choosing your aspirations over hesitations? Let's jump in. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the very first episode of this podcast. Aspirations Over Hesitations started as a blog idea shortly after I got out of college when I was in my early 20s. And I am so excited to bring it to you today in this format with a lot of life experience that I have accumulated along the way. I thought today that I would focus on my journey into motherhood because it really is the driving force behind everything that I do. So when I was in my early 20s, or even before my early 20s as a teenager, I always knew that I wanted to be a mom. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. She was really involved in the lives of me and my siblings when we were younger. And if you asked me what I liked doing when I was little, it was playing house and teacher and school and just kind of like all of those nurturing things. When I was in college, I worked part-time at a daycare, and I also served as a babysitter and a summer nanny for a family. After college, when I got married, my husband and I talked, and we were just really focused on getting our careers up and running. We were trying to make money. We were trying to buy a house. There was a lot going on that we were doing just to try to kind of steady ourselves and get things to where we wanted them to be before we wanted to bring kids into the picture. So, once we got, I would say, closer to like 30, we started to get a little bit more serious about when do we want to start thinking about having kids or trying to have kids. And we had a big trip planned for my 30th birthday where we were going to go actually internationally, which was a pretty big deal for us, especially at the time. And so we wanted to wait until after that trip before we started trying. We're both planners, but especially me. And so the plan was to start trying shortly after that trip, but then I started to experience some issues with acne again. Acne is something I struggled with a lot when I was a teenager and into my early 20s and mid-20s before we got married, when I finally did a round of Accutane. I think I was 25, 26 when I did that. And so my skin had been really good kind of in those later 20 years leading up to me turning 30, but it started to get bad again around that time after we got back from Paris. And so I was on the fence about, do I do another round of Accutane? Do I not? When you're on Accutane, it's like super serious. You cannot get pregnant. You have to be on birth control and do all the things to prevent pregnancy. And so I decided that I would do a second round of Accutane because it kind of felt like, based on where we were at that time, that it was now or never. That if I was going to do another round, it made sense to do it before we started having children and hopefully get my skin to clear up for good before pregnancy and other hormonal shifts that can interfere with your skin as well. So I went on birth control and did Accutane again. And after I finished that round, I got off birth control pretty quickly because I did want there to be a decent gap in like when I had been taking that versus when we decided to start to try to get pregnant. So I don't remember exactly how long I was off of it before we started trying, but it was at least a few months, if not longer. And when we finally started trying to get pregnant, the planner in me like wanted to plan it down to the month that we would conceive. I was very naive and at the time said things like, oh, I really don't want to be pregnant during like the hottest months of the summer, especially because we live in Texas. So when can we start trying so that hopefully, I won't be super pregnant in June, July, August. Things that now looking back, it's like such a blessing to be pregnant in the heat of the summer or anytime really when you're trying. But at the time I didn't know any better and said things out loud that were very cringy. So it only did take us a few months once we started trying, and I was honestly pretty surprised when we got our positive pregnancy test, and we were super excited. We found out right after Labor Day weekend, so early September. And what was really special is the due date of that pregnancy was on my late cousin's birthday. And this was a cousin that we had lost to breast cancer when she was young, in her like late 30s or maybe early 40s. And so I just felt like that was a really cool sign that new life was coming back into our family after we had experienced a period of loss that included her and also my grandmother and my uncle. And so once we found out the due date, we again put on our planner hat, started calculating all of the things, when we wanted the child to start kindergarten, did we want them to be the oldest kid in their class or the youngest kid in their class, and of course, would it be a boy or a girl? And I think that just from what people had told me that, you should wait until you get through the first trimester to start telling people that you're pregnant. We didn't jump to start telling people right away, especially because also I had some like early spotting during week 4 and week 5. And that made me really nervous, but we had gone to the doctor, gotten checked out. And based on some of those early scans and blood work, I was told that things looked good, that it seemed to be progressing, but just to keep an eye on things, and if the spotting turned into bleeding or if it started to get crampy, like to reevaluate and come back in. But I felt hopeful. I felt pretty encouraged based on the lab work and what I was told when I went in for some of those early scans. And so I wasn't really too concerned, also because it was my first pregnancy. I just didn't know what to expect. I didn't really know what was normal or not normal, and I think excitement was the thing that we felt more than anything. So I did finally tell my mom that we were pregnant. It was when we were 6 weeks exactly. I told her that morning before I started work on FaceTime, and she was super excited. I knew she would be, but it was really special and sweet to get to tell her that. And then I went about my work day. This was in September of 2020, so the height of COVID. We were working from home completely, and so I worked from home that day. My husband was working from home too. And after work, I did kind of start to feel crampy, like I just didn't really feel super well that whole afternoon. And I experienced this like kind of rush feeling and realized that the spotting had turned into bleeding, that it was now bright red blood, and I immediately knew that it wasn't good and called my husband to come downstairs. And I'm going to share a little bit more about what ended up being a miscarriage, but I just want to give a little warning if this is triggering. You might want to just fast forward the next 10 minutes or so. And then on the flip side, if you want to know even more details, I know sometimes it can be, while sad, also helpful to hear stories of people that have experienced miscarriage and then go on to become mothers. I would be happy to send you a really detailed play-by-play that I wrote in 2021 as part of my healing process. You can just click on one of the links in the show notes and I will email that to you. But for now, I'm going to give my attempt at the condensed version of what was a super traumatic experience. So the bleeding started around 5 p.m. and I immediately called my OB's office, and because it was after 5 p.m., it was an after hours line, but they advised me what to do and what to expect, and said to stay at home, that the bleeding would be heavier than a period, probably for a few hours, and then it would taper off. I asked them, like, well, how do I know if, like, things are getting bad and I need to go to the hospital? And so they told me a few things to look for, but in general, I think we were both hopeful that I wouldn't have to go to the hospital, since it was during COVID and everybody was trying to stay out of hospitals if at all possible. So I kind of dealt with things at home for those evening hours with the help of my husband. He had to go to the store to grab pads and diapers and other things, like things that you just don't have on hand when you're pregnant and you're not expecting something like this to happen. So the other thing that I should mention is our dog had canine cancer as this was going on and was getting to the end of his life. And so he was really sick and at home with us and required a lot of care and attention. And so we wanted to make sure that we were able to stay with him if possible as well. So I thought everything was normal for at least a few hours. And even I think once I started to go to bed, I mean, it was a horrible experience, and I will never forget, like, the sounds that I heard, and it just felt like a sink faucet was on, and it was just so loud and, like, disgusting. And then once I got ready to go to bed and laid down, I kind of expected that things would, like, slow down. They had started to slow down a little bit. I tried to go to sleep, and then I think it was around midnight that I woke up, or I don't even think I was fully asleep, but I kind of became more aware of being awake and just felt this, like, gush. And I got up and went to the bathroom and realized that I was, like, at this point soaking through pads, which was one of the signs that they had told me to keep an eye out for. So I tried to see if it was just like a fluke, because I had been laying down for so long. I think I maybe laid back down. It happened again. I called the OB's office back, and by this point it's the middle of the night. It's like 2 or 3 in the morning. And I will never forget the OB that answered, or that called me back in the middle of the night. She wasn't my OB, but she was from the practice. And she sounded like she was half asleep. And she was basically just like, yeah, I hear you saying that you're losing a lot of blood, but it's probably just because this is heavier than, like, any period you would have ever experienced. The way that you're talking and the way that you sound, like, you sound totally fine. So I think you're probably fine, but if it makes you feel better, like, you can always go to the hospital. So that just made me feel like, okay, maybe I was over exaggerating and I really was fine, if, she thought I sounded fine, whatever that means. So we did stay at home and let this process continue for longer. And then things started to get really bad, and I was just, like, super shaky, breaking out in, like, sweats left and right, starting to feel like I was going to pass out. And so finally I said, I think we need to go to the hospital. Like, we just need to leave. Obviously our dog Kingsley is going to be here. We can figure out later, like, if, Dustin needs to come back or somebody else needs to come back to let him out. But I really felt like at that point we just had to go to the hospital. And so we went to the hospital, which fortunately was a very close drive to our house, like 10 minutes, and went right to the ER and got admitted. And there were so many things about that experience that were just horrible. I can remember after they did another ultrasound, trying to go from like the wheelchair that they had me in into the bed in the hospital room. And like, when I stood up, I lost my hearing and like I couldn't hear anything. It was so scary. And I told them that. And then I was like dry heaving into the air, just like having all of these symptoms. My blood pressure was all over the place. And it was obvious that because I had lost so much blood at this point, that things were escalating. And so I was given the option to take a pill to try to get I think the doctor said, try to induce the process to like continue, or surgery. But she told me it could be a while for surgery because they would have to find an operating room. So she was kind of encouraging me to at least try the pill first to hopefully avoid the surgery. So I did. Didn't help at all. If anything, it only made things worse. And hours go by before they're able to find an operating room. And then finally they do. And by this point, like, I'm verbalizing that I feel like I'm dying, that I'm super scared. And they're saying, like, you're okay, you're in a hospital. And I just was asking, like, when am I going to feel like I'm not dying anymore? And they said, after your surgery, like when you get a blood transfusion, that's when you'll feel better. And so I remember having to like sign consent forms and everything for the blood transfusion. And after I came out of the operating room, when I came to, I was receiving the bags of blood, and I did feel a little bit better in terms of some of like the symptoms that I was having. But of course I felt just absolutely horrible now, having lost this baby and gone through this really traumatic physical experience where I had lost so much blood and felt like I was going to die. And after that happened, I don't know, it just really shook me in so many ways. Like, of course, there's the grief that comes with losing a child, but then there was also all of those feelings of like, what is wrong with me and why did this happen? And like, what is wrong with me that led to this happening? And just, I was scared too, wondering like, do I have a blood clotting disorder? Or like, why did I just continue to bleed like that, for so long and so many hours? And it also was, pretty early in the pregnancy. Like, I was 6 weeks, which I'm not saying to like minimize any of it or minimize early losses, but it was just surprising to me that even at 6 weeks, I would have had that type of experience. And so when I went to the OB's office 2 weeks later for my follow-up visit, I can remember the doctor saying to me, what happened was normal. Like, first trimester miscarriages are very common. However, how it happened to you was not normal. And that really stuck with me and felt somewhat validating that she was acknowledging that, even from her point of view, obviously OBs see lots of things, that this was definitely up there in a pretty like catastrophic experience. And so I asked her, like, what can I do to avoid having this happen again? Like, we knew that we wanted to go on and hopefully have a healthy pregnancy, but quite honestly, I was terrified of even trying and ever having something like that happen again. And I wasn't trying to jump into trying again right away, but I just wanted to know, like, what can I do to improve my chances of having a healthy pregnancy? And she was like, well, there is some lab work that we sometimes do after miscarriages, but typically the kind of like bigger full panel isn't recommended until you've had like 3 miscarriages in a row, which I was so just disgusted to hear that, because why would anyone want to have 3 miscarriages in a row before they can get a more comprehensive lab panel done? But fortunately, she said that she would be willing to order it for me to just see, because I had such an atypical experience. And so we did that lab work. There was nothing major that came back on it. Actually, she was going to write off the whole thing altogether. I noticed something that was very minor that I ended up just being more aware of going forward. But otherwise, it was kind of said to be a completely normal panel. And that didn't feel at all complete to me. It didn't feel like an answer. I still was not being told by anyone like why I would have had this experience. There were no explanations or answers, and I just felt like I had to do more, and I really wanted to do more. And functional medicine is something that I had kind of heard about. I'd heard about integrative practitioners and holistic practitioners really in the past when I was looking for solutions to my acne. And I had never done anything at the time because I knew that they were expensive and not covered by insurance. But after this experience, I didn't care. I was willing to do literally anything to avoid that happening again. And so I found a practice in the DFW area, which is Dallas-Fort Worth, and got on their wait list. It was a pretty popular practice, and so I think I got on the wait list in November and wasn't able to get an appointment until May. So it was going to be a little while. And I just thought I would get on the wait list and then kind of see what happened between November and the spring to decide how I wanted to move forward. There were a few months during that time after the first of the year when we did kind of start trying to get pregnant again, and it just wasn't happening in the first, 2 or 3 months. So I took that as a sign that my body wasn't ready. I was also having really bad skin flare-ups again during that time. But this time the skin flare-ups that I was having were different than what I had experienced before Accutane. So now it was more of like this rash, kind of super itchy, like all over my face. And I found out from my dermatologist that it was called perioral dermatitis. And I think that the miscarriage probably caused some of that to flare up because of all of the hormonal changes that you are going through when that happens. But my face was like an absolute disaster. And so I was just in so much pain physically from that I was like, I have to wait and get in with this functional medicine provider because I have to fix my skin and I have to get answers to why I had this miscarriage. And like by this point I was starting to think maybe some of this is related. Because the other thing that I forgot to mention is before we got pregnant in September of 2020, my hair was like kind of falling out. And so I had done lab work with just my regular primary care doctor. And she checked my thyroid according to her and said everything was fine. But then when I went back and looked at those labs after all of this, I realized that it wasn't fine. Like even though my TSH was technically within the normal range, it was very high, especially for what you want it to be for fertility purposes. And so I was just starting to feel like all of this was connected and I needed to go a little bit deeper. So I had my first functional medicine appointment ever in May of 2021, and it was such a refreshing experience. The provider spent so much time with me. I think our first appointment was 2 hours long, and we just talked about all of my health history, like from the time that I was in my mom's womb to when I was little, and just all of the things that you would think are not related to issues that you are experiencing in life now, but really at least for me, they were. She ended up recommending some additional detailed lab work along with food sensitivity testing, a nutrient deficiency panel, and a gut test. So I did all three of those tests and found out that I was having pretty significant responses to gluten, dairy, and eggs. Obviously, these are three main food categories, and I was advised to cut them all out, at least temporarily, so that we could allow my gut to just calm down and be able to heal while not continuing to put fuel on the fire. I ended up, as part of my kind of initial protocol with her, I went on some herbs, and they were herbs that you can't take while you're pregnant or trying to get pregnant. So we put a pause on that and said, let's get through this protocol. I really wanted to go all in on it. And really within the first few weeks, I was starting to see huge improvements to my skin, which was a really big motivation for me to keep going, because I knew that whatever I was doing, if it was changing things on the outside, I figured it had to be changing things on the inside as well. So I think by the time I was done with that whole first protocol, it was around November of 2021. And I felt so much better. That first protocol did such wonders for me. It really changed so many things, so many symptoms that I was having, and just a lot of interconnected issues that I didn't even realize were connected at the time. We ended up, after we started trying again in November, we got pregnant pretty much right away. I think it was month 1 or month 2. And this pregnancy was very different than the first, in all of the anxiety that I felt from the very second that I got that positive pregnancy test. So when I had my first pregnancy and I got the positive test, I was just excited. That was the sole emotion that I felt, was excited and hopeful, and let me plan and, wonder and just do all of these things. And with the second time, it was just honestly kind of sad, because I felt like I couldn't experience any of those positive emotions because I was just so worried about, is it going to be different this time? What if it happens again? Obsessed about trying to control everything. I didn't want to go through the scanners at the airport because I was worried that something, would affect the baby or interfere with the pregnancy. I calculated everything. So we found out that we were pregnant right before we went to Florida for Christmas. And then I was calculating how far along I would be while we were there, when I could do my first lab work to measure if my HCG was doubling, and when we could test my progesterone to see if I wanted to supplement with progesterone this time, because that was something that I didn't do during my first pregnancy, even though my progesterone, looking back on lab work, was actually on the lower side of things. Calculating when I could go and get my first sonogram, because that was something that was going to be just a super big deal for me to get some, hopefully, reassurance that everything was good. Which we did that first sonogram, I think at 5.5 weeks, and saw a heartbeat, which was so reassuring and honestly just so amazing to see a heartbeat that early on, to know that there was this little baby in there whose heart was already beating. I tried to stay positive. I really am someone that believes in manifestation, and just our mindset and all of that is so important. And so I really did try. I had affirmations and meditations and just different things that I would do to try to keep my energy up. But in reality, I was very scared, and I was especially terrified of being home alone during that time. So if my husband was traveling for work, I always coordinated somebody to come and stay with me, because I, especially during the first trimester, just never wanted to be alone in case something bad were to happen. So we had our son in September of 2022, and it was just, oh my gosh, I was so scared during the first trimester. I think I eased up on that a little bit during the second trimester, and then during the third trimester I had a lot of anxiety too because I had low fluids and some different things. And then his birth, well, my labor and delivery were actually both super, super long and hard. And so when I finally had him placed on my chest, it was like such a relief. And I felt like I could breathe for the first time in 10 months, knowing that I now actually had this live, healthy baby, like breathing on my body. And I, at the time, was working in a corporate job that had a pretty generous maternity leave. Our maternity leave was 18 weeks. And I say generous based on what many other companies and people have in the United States. But I know that 18 weeks is actually not nearly enough time. But I was grateful to be able to be home with him for those 18 weeks and just really realize like how tiny and dependent and fragile these babies are, even when they're 4.5 months, and it became time for me to start to go back to work. We were still 100% remote from the COVID policies that the company had in place. And so it did help with my transition back to work because at least I didn't have to go to the office and leave my baby for countless hours on end. But it was still very hard in figuring out just childcare. We don't have any family in Texas. And so figuring out who was going to care for this baby during the time that I was away and nursing and trying to figure out pumping and all the things, like it was just a lot. So going back after I had him, like it was very hard, but it was also manageable, I think mostly due to that remote work flexibility. So I returned to work in January, and I think it was May that then an announcement came out that we needed to start to think about returning to the office 3 days a week. And when that came out, I just had a sick feeling in my stomach because as much as I preferred working from home before I had my baby, I strongly preferred it after I became a mother. Like there was no contest. I in no way, shape, or form would have chose working in the office when working from home was a totally viable possibility. And I think I knew subconsciously that that was the beginning of the end for me. I knew that I did not want to do that. My office was over an hour away with commuting and just all traffic and everything, that I had to navigate going into the office. And it was super stressful. It was so stressful carrying all of the pumping stuff into work and trying to sneak away for super short amounts of time to be able to pump the amount of milk that I needed to keep my supply up and make sure that my baby had enough milk while I was gone. And I just quite honestly hated it. And by this point, my husband had left his company and he had started his own business. And so I got to see all of the freedom and flexibility that he had while we had this young baby at home. And I started to honestly get really resentful and kind of had this attitude of like, when is it going to be my turn? Like I have worked so hard to climb this corporate ladder and now we have this baby, and I felt when I was younger I wanted to be a stay-at-home mom. Like we had talked about me wanting to be a stay-at-home mom and making that possible, and now here we were and it wasn't possible, and I was in these meetings all day like stuck hearing about stuff that I really didn't care about, at least not when it came down to that versus what I had going on at home. And it was just hard. So after the baby would go to bed, I would pretty much just crash on the couch. I would plop down, want to watch some high intensity show to try to take my mind off of things. I would maybe grab some red wine while watching said show, just really anything to try to stop the constant mental chatter that was going on in my mind when I was trying to navigate those early days of motherhood and working full time and going back to the office and commuting and pumping and just all of the things. Having a baby takes a lot out of you, like the pregnancy, the delivery, the breastfeeding, you're nutrient depleted, you're starving and hungry all the time and trying to keep up, just making sure you're eating enough calories and drinking enough water and getting electrolytes. And it just felt like a full-time job in and of itself. And add to this, like, the chronic stress of living that type of a life. And I started to notice that some of the symptoms that I had pre-baby were starting to pop back up. So especially stomach things like just bloating and digestive issues. So I went back to the functional medicine provider, did some other testing now that I was postpartum, just wanted to see like where things were at, and got her recommendations. And I can remember still to this day looking over her plan for me, which was a few pages long. She was very thorough in her recommendations. And in multiple places on the plan, it said reduce or eliminate chronic stress. And basically, her assessment was you can't really heal. And if we're talking about healing your gut specifically, you can't do that while you're in a state of chronic stress and hurry and rushing, because the two things just don't really go together. In the next episode, I will talk about how this both mental and physical state that I was in led me to take a leave of absence from work, and how that led me to never going back to work, which was honestly the biggest blessing that I could have ever asked for. And I was very fortunate because it happened in a way that I received so much more financial support than I could have ever expected, and did not have to go through like all of the struggle and sacrifice that people will often try to feed you when you're on the fence about whether or not you should continue working, or if you are wanting to lean more into motherhood and go that route. So if this sounds interesting to you, I would love it if you would subscribe to the show. That way you never miss an episode. And also, please leave a review. It really helps a lot, especially since this is a new podcast. And I hope that you loved this first episode and just learning more about me and my journey into motherhood. It has definitely been a journey and continues to be, and I would love to know what you think. So please feel free to reach out to me on Instagram, sign up for the email in the show notes if you want even more details, and leave a review if you feel so inclined. Thanks for listening. See you next time.